Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The History of Sexuality, Volume 1, An Introduction, by Michel Foucault, translated by Robert Hurley, narrated by Michael Page. Part 1. We Other Victorians. For a long time, the story goes, we supported a Victorian regime, and we continue to be dominated by it even today. Thus the image of the imperial prude is emblazoned on our restrained, mute, and hypocritical sexuality. At the beginning of the 17th century, a certain frankness was still common, it would seem. Sexual practices had little need of secrecy. Words were said without undue reticence, and things were done without too much concealment. One had a tolerant familiarity with the illicit. Codes regulating the coarse, the obscene, and the indecent were quite lax compared to those of the 19th century. It was a time of direct gestures, shameless discourse, and open transgressions, when anatomies were shown and intermingled at will, and knowing children hung about amid the laughter of adults. It was a period when bodies made a display of themselves. But twilight soon fell upon this bright day, followed by the monotonous nights of the Victorian bourgeoisie. Sexuality was carefully confined. It moved into the home. The conjugal family took custody of it and absorbed it into the serious function of reproduction. On the subject of sex, silence became the rule. The legitimate and procreative couple laid down the law. The couple imposed itself as model, enforced the norm, safeguarded the truth, and reserved the right to speak while retaining the principle of secrecy. A single locus of sexuality was acknowledged in social space as well as the heart of every household, but it was a utilitarian and fertile one, the parents' bedroom. The rest had only to remain vague. Proper demeanour avoided contact with other bodies, and verbal decency sanitized one's speech, and sterile behavior carried the taint of abnormality. If it insisted on making itself too visible, it would be designated accordingly, and would have to pay the penalty. Nothing that was not ordered in terms of generation or transfigured by it could expect sanction or protection, nor did it merit a hearing. It would be driven out, denied, and reduced to silence. Not only did it not exist, it had no right to exist, and would be made to disappear upon its least manifestation, whether in acts or in words. Everyone knew, for example, that children had no sex, which was why they were forbidden to talk about it, why one closed one's eyes and stopped one's ears whenever they came to show evidence to the contrary, and why a general and studied silence was imposed. These are the characteristic features attributed to repression, which served to distinguish it from the prohibitions maintained by penal law. Repression operated as a sentence to disappear, but also as an injunction to silence, an affirmation of non-existence, and, by implication, an admission that there was nothing to say about such things, nothing to see, and nothing to know. Such was the hypocrisy of our bourgeois societies with its halting logic. It was forced to make a few concessions, however. If it was truly necessary to make room for illegitimate sexualities, it was reasoned, let them take their infernal mischief elsewhere, to a place where they could be reintegrated, if not in the circuits of production, at least in those of profit. The brothel and the mental hospital would be those places of tolerance. The prostitute, the client, and the pimp, together with the psychiatrist and his hysteric, those other Victorians, as Stephen Marcus would say, seem to have surreptitiously transferred the pleasures that are unspoken into the order of things that are counted. Words and gestures, quietly authorized, could be exchanged there at the going rate. Only in those places would untrammelled sex have a right to safely insularized forms of reality, and only to clandestine, circumscribed, and coded types of discourse. Everywhere else, modern Puritanism imposed its triple edict of taboo, non-existence, and silence. But have we not liberated ourselves from those 2 long centuries in which the history of sexuality must be seen first of all as the chronicle of an increasing repression? Only to a slight extent, we are told. Perhaps some progress was made by Freud, but with such circumspection, such medical prudence, a scientific guarantee of innocuousness, and so many precautions in order to contain everything, with no fear of overflow, in that safest and most discreet of spaces between the couch and discourse, yet another round of whispering on a bed. And could things have been otherwise? We are informed that if repression has indeed been the fundamental link between power, knowledge, and sexuality since the classical age, it stands to reason that we will not be able to free ourselves from it except at a considerable cost. Nothing less than a transgression of laws, a lifting of prohibitions, an eruption of speech, a reinstating of pleasure within reality, and a whole new economy in the mechanisms of power will be required. For the least glimmer of truth is conditioned by politics. Hence one cannot hope to obtain the desired results simply from a medical practice nor from a theoretical discourse, however rigorously pursued. Thus one denounces Freud's conformism, the normalizing functions of psychoanalysis, the obvious timidity underlying Reich's vehemence, and all the effects of integration ensured by the science of sex and the barely equivocal practices of sexology. This discourse on modern sexual repression holds up well, owing no doubt to how easy it is to uphold. A solemn historical and political guarantee protects it. By placing the advent of the age of repression in the 17th century, after hundreds of years of open spaces and free expression, one adjusts it to coincide with the development of capitalism. It becomes an integral part of the bourgeois order. The minor chronicle of sex and its trials is transposed into the ceremonious history of the modes of production. Its trifling aspect fades from view. A principle of explanation emerges after the fact. If sex is so rigorously repressed, this is because it is incompatible with a general and intensive work imperative. At a time when labor capacity was being systematically exploited, how could this capacity be allowed to dissipate itself in pleasurable pursuits, except in those, reduced to a minimum, that enabled it to reproduce itself? Sex and its effects are perhaps not so easily deciphered. On the other hand, their repression, thus reconstructed, is easily analyzed. And the sexual cause, the demand for sexual freedom, but also for the knowledge to be gained from sex and the right to speak about it, becomes legitimately associated with the honor of a political cause. Sex, too, is placed on the agenda for the future. A suspicious mind might wonder if taking so many precautions in order to give the history of sex such an impressive filiation does not bear traces of the same old prudishness, as if those valorizing correlations were necessary before such a discourse could be formulated or accepted. But there may be another reason that makes it so gratifying for us to define the relationship between sex and power in terms of repression. Something that one might call the speaker's benefit. If sex is repressed, that is, condemned to prohibition, non-existence, and silence, then the mere fact that one is speaking about it has the appearance of a deliberate transgression. A person who holds forth in such language places himself to a certain extent outside the reach of power. He upsets established law. He somehow anticipates the coming freedom. This explains the solemnity with which one speaks of sex nowadays. When they had to allude to it, the first demographers and psychiatrists of the 19th century thought it advisable to excuse themselves for asking their readers to dwell on matters so trivial and base. But for decades now we have found it difficult to speak on the subject without striking a different pose. We are conscious of defying established power. Our tone of voice shows that we know we are being subversive, and we ardently conjure away the present and appeal to the future, whose day will be hastened by the contribution we believe we are making. Something that smacks of revolt, of promised freedom, of the coming age of a different law, slips easily into this discourse on sexual oppression. Some of the ancient functions of prophecy are reactivated therein. Tomorrow sex will be good again. Because this repression is affirmed, one can discreetly bring into coexistence concepts which the fear of ridicule or the bitterness of history prevents most of us from putting side by side. revolution and happiness, or revolution and a different body, one that is newer and more beautiful, or indeed revolution and pleasure. What sustains our eagerness to speak of sex in terms of repression is doubtless this opportunity to speak out against the powers that be, to utter truths and promise bliss, to link together enlightenment, liberation, and manifold pleasures, to pronounce a discourse that combines the fervour of knowledge, the determination to change the laws, and the longing for the garden of earthly delights. This is perhaps what also explains the market value attributed not only to what is said about sexual repression, but also to the mere fact of lending an ear to those who would eliminate the effects of repression. Ours is, after all, the only civilization in which officials are paid to listen to all and sundry impart the secrets of their sex, as if the urge to talk about it and the interest one hopes to arouse by doing so have far surpassed the possibilities of being heard, so that some individuals have even offered their ears for hire. But it appears to me that the essential thing is not this economic factor, but rather the existence in our era of a discourse in which sex, the revelation of truth, the overturning of global laws, the proclamation of a new day to come, and the promise of a certain felicity are linked together. Today it is sex that serves as a support for the ancient form, so familiar and important in the West, of preaching. A great sexual sermon, which has had its subtle theologians and its popular voices, has swept through our societies over the last decades. It has chastised the old order, denounced hypocrisy, and praised the rights of the immediate and the real. It has made people dream of a new city. The Franciscans are called to mind, and we might wonder how it is possible that the lyricism and religiosity that long accompanied the revolutionary project have, in Western industrial societies, been largely carried over to sex. The notion of repressed sex is not, therefore, only a theoretical matter. The affirmation of a sexuality that has never been more rigorously subjugated than during the age of the hypocritical, bustling, and responsible bourgeoisie is coupled with the grandiloquence of a discourse purporting to reveal the truth about sex, modify its economy within reality, subvert the law that governs it, and change its future. The statement of oppression and the form of the sermon refer back to one another. They are mutually reinforcing. To say that sex is not repressed, or rather that the relationship between sex and power is not characterized by repression, is to risk falling into a sterile paradox. It not only runs counter to a well-accepted argument, it goes against the whole economy and all the discursive interests that underlie this argument. This is the point at which I would like to situate the series of historical analyses that will follow, the present volume being at the same time an introduction and a first attempt at an overview. It surveys a few historically significant points and outlines certain theoretical problems. Briefly, my aim is to examine the case of a society which has been loudly castigating itself for its hypocrisy for more than a century, which speaks verbosely of its own silence, takes great pains to relate in detail the things it does not say, denounces the powers it exercises, and promises to liberate itself from the very laws that have made it function. I would like to explore not only these discourses, but also the will that sustains them, and the strategic intention that supports them. The question I would like to pose is not why are we repressed, but rather why do we say, with so much passion and so much resentment against our most recent past, against our present and against ourselves, that we are repressed? By what spiral did we come to affirm that sex is negated? What led us to show ostentatiously that sex is something we hide, to say it is something we silence? And we do all this by formulating the matter in the most explicit terms, by trying to reveal it in its most naked reality, by affirming it in the positivity of its power and its effects. It is certainly legitimate to ask why sex was associated with sin for such a long time, although it would remain to be discovered how this association was formed, and one would have to be careful not to state in a summary and hasty fashion that sex was condemned. But we must also ask why we burden ourselves today with so much guilt for having once made sex a sin. What paths have brought us to the point where we are at fault with respect to our own sex? And how have we come to be a civilization so peculiar as to tell itself that, through an abuse of power which has not ended, it has long sinned against sex? How does one account for the displacement which, while claiming to free us from the sinful nature of sex, taxes us with a great historical wrong which consists precisely in imagining that nature to be blameworthy and in drawing disastrous consequences from that belief? It will be said that if so many people today affirm this repression, the reason is that it is historically evident. And if they speak of it so abundantly, as they have for such a long time now, this is because repression is so firmly anchored, having solid roots and reasons, and weighs so heavily on sex that more than one denunciation will be required in order to free ourselves from it. The job will be a long one. All the longer, no doubt, as it is in the nature of power, particularly the kind of power that operates in our society, to be repressive, and to be especially careful in repressing useless energies, the intensity of pleasures, and irregular modes of behavior. We must not be surprised, then, if the effects of liberation vis-à-vis this repressive power are so slow to manifest themselves. The effort to speak freely about sex and accept it in its reality is so alien to a historical sequence that has gone unbroken for 1,000 years now, and so inimical to the intrinsic mechanisms of power, that it is bound to make little headway for a long time before succeeding in its mission. One can raise 3 serious doubts concerning what I shall term the repressive hypothesis. First doubt: is sexual repression truly an established historical fact? Is what first comes into view, and consequently permits one to advance an initial hypothesis, really the accentuation or even the establishment of a regime of sexual repression beginning in the 17th century? This is a properly historical question. Second doubt: do the workings of power, and in particular those mechanisms that are brought into play in societies such as ours, really belong primarily to the category of repression? Are prohibition, censorship, and denial truly the forms through which power is exercised in a general way, if not in every society, most certainly in our own? This is a historico-theoretical question. A third and final doubt: did the critical discourse that addresses itself to repression come to act as a roadblock to a power mechanism that had operated unchallenged up to that point? Or is it not, in fact, part of the same historical network as the thing it denounces, and doubtless misrepresents, by calling it repression? Was there really a historical rupture between the age of repression and the critical analysis of repression? This is a historico-political question. My purpose in introducing these 3 doubts is not merely to construct counter-arguments that are symmetrical and contrary to those outlined above. It is not a matter of saying that sexuality, far from being repressed in capitalist and bourgeois societies, has on the contrary benefited from a regime of unchanging liberty, nor is it a matter of saying that power in societies such as ours is more tolerant than repressive, and that the critique of repression, while it may give itself airs of a rupture with the past, actually forms part of a much older process, and, depending on how one chooses to understand this process, will appear either as a new episode in the lessening of prohibitions or as a more devious and discreet form of power. The doubts I would like to oppose to the repressive hypothesis are aimed less at showing it to be mistaken than at putting it back within a general economy of discourses on sex in modern societies since the 17th century. Why has sexuality been so widely discussed, and what has been said about it? What were the effects of power generated by what was said? What are the links between these discourses, these effects of power, and the pleasures that were invested by them? What knowledge, savoir, was formed as a result of this linkage? The object, in short, is to define the regime of power, knowledge, pleasure that sustains the discourse on human sexuality in our part of the world. The central issue, then, at least in the first instance, is not to determine whether one says yes or no to sex, whether one formulates prohibitions or permissions, whether one asserts its importance or denies its effects, or whether one refines the words one uses to designate it, but to account for the fact that it is spoken about, to discover who does the speaking, the positions and viewpoints from which they speak, the institutions which prompt people to speak about it and which store and distribute the things that are said. What is at issue, briefly, is the overall discursive fact, the way in which sex is put into discourse. Hence, too, my main concern will be to locate the forms of power, the channels it takes, and the discourses it permeates in order to reach the most tenuous and individual modes of behavior, the paths that give it access to the rare or scarcely perceivable forms of desire, how it penetrates and controls everyday pleasure. All this entailing effects that may be those of refusal, blockage, and invalidation, but also incitement and intensification. In short, the polymorphous techniques of power. And finally, the essential aim will not be to determine whether these discursive productions and these effects of power lead one to formulate the truth about sex, or on the contrary falsehoods designed to conceal that truth, but rather to bring out the will to knowledge that serves as both their support and their instrument. Let there be no misunderstanding. I do not claim that sex has not been prohibited or barred or masked or misapprehended since the classical age, nor do I even assert that it has suffered these things any less from that period on than before. I do not maintain that the prohibition of sex is a ruse, but it is a ruse to make prohibition into the basic and constitutive element from which one would be able to write the history of what has been said concerning sex starting from the modern epoch. All these negative elements, defences, censorships, denials, which the repressive hypothesis groups together in one great central mechanism destined to say no, are doubtless only component parts that have a local and tactical role to play in a transformation into discourse, a technology of power, and a will to knowledge that are far from being reducible to the former. In short, I would like to disengage my analysis from the privileges generally accorded the economy of scarcity and the principles of rarefaction, to search instead for instances of discursive production, which also administer silences, to be sure, of the production of power, which sometimes have the function of prohibiting, of the propagation of knowledge, which often cause mistaken beliefs or systematic misconceptions to circulate. I would like to write the history of these instances and their transformations. A first survey made from this viewpoint seems to indicate that since the end of the 16th century, the putting into discourse of sex, far from undergoing a process of restriction, on the contrary, has been subjected to a mechanism of increasing incitement, that the techniques of power exercised over sex have not obeyed a principle of rigorous selection, but rather one of dissemination and implantation of polymorphous sexualities, and that the will to knowledge has not come to a halt in the face of a taboo that must not be lifted, but has persisted in constituting, despite many mistakes of course, a science of sexuality. It is these movements that I will now attempt to bring into focus in a schematic way, bypassing, as it were, the repressive hypothesis and the facts of interdiction or exclusion it invokes, and starting from certain historical facts that serve as guidelines for research. Part 2. The Repressive Hypothesis. 1. The Incitement to Discourse. The 17th century, then, was the beginning of an age of repression emblematic of what we call the bourgeois societies, an age which perhaps we still have not completely left behind. Calling sex by its name thereafter became more difficult and more costly, as if in order to gain mastery over it in reality, it had first been necessary to subjugate it at the level of language, control its free circulation in speech, expunge it from the things that were said, and extinguish the words that rendered it too visibly present. And even these prohibitions, it seems, were afraid to name it. Without even having to pronounce the word, modern prudishness was able to ensure that one did not speak of sex merely through the interplay of prohibitions that referred back to one another, instances of muteness which, by dint of saying nothing, imposed silence. Censorship. Yet when one looks back over these last 3 centuries with their continual transformations, things appear in a very different light. Around and apropos of sex, one sees a veritable discursive explosion. We must be clear on this point, however. It is quite possible that there was an expurgation, and a very rigorous one, of the authorized vocabulary. It may indeed be true that a whole rhetoric of allusion and metaphor was codified. Without question, new rules of propriety screened out some words. There was a policing of statements, a control over enunciations as well. Where and when it was not possible to talk about such things became much more strictly defined. In which circumstances, among which speakers, and within which social relationships. Areas were thus established, if not of utter silence, at least of tact and discretion, between parents and children, for instance, or teachers and pupils, or masters and domestic servants. This almost certainly constituted a whole restrictive economy, one that was incorporated into that politics of language and speech, spontaneous on the one hand, concerted on the other, which accompanied the social redistributions of the classical period. At the level of discourses and their domains, however, practically the opposite phenomenon occurred. There was a steady proliferation of discourses concerned with sex, specific discourses different from one another both by their form and by their object, a discursive ferment that gathered momentum from the 18th century onward. Here I am thinking not so much of the probable increase in illicit discourses, that is, discourses of infraction that crudely named sex by way of insult or mockery of the new code of decency. The tightening up of the rules of decorum likely did produce, as a counter-effect, a valorization and intensification of indecent speech. But more important was the multiplication of discourses concerning sex in the field of exercise of power itself. An institutional incitement to speak about it, and to do so more and more. A determination on the part of the agencies of power to hear it spoken about, and to cause it to speak through explicit articulation and endlessly accumulated detail. Consider the evolution of the Catholic pastoral and the sacrament of penance after the Council of Trent. Little by little, the nakedness of the questions formulated by the confession manuals of the Middle Ages, and a good number of those still in use in the 17th century, was veiled. One avoided entering into that degree of detail which some authors, such as Sanchez or Tamburini, had for a long time believed indispensable for the confession to be complete. Description of the respective positions of the partners, the postures assumed, gestures, places touched, caresses, the precise moment of pleasure, an entire painstaking review of the sexual act in its very unfolding. Discretion was advised with increasing emphasis. The greatest reserve was counselled when dealing with sins against purity. This matter is similar to pitch, for, however one might handle it, even to cast it far from oneself, it sticks none the less, and always soils. And later, Alfonso de Liguori prescribed starting, and possibly going no further, especially when dealing with children, with questions that were roundabout and vague. But while the language may have been refined, the scope of the confession of the flesh, continually increased. This was partly because the Counter-Reformation busied itself with stepping up the rhythm of the yearly confession in the Catholic countries, and because it tried to impose meticulous rules of self-examination. But above all, because it attributed more and more importance in penance, and perhaps at the expense of some other sins, to all the insinuations of the flesh. Thoughts, desires, voluptuous imaginings, delectations, combined movements of the body and the soul. Henceforth all this had to enter in detail into the process of confession and guidance. According to the new pastoral, sex must not be named imprudently, but its aspects, its correlations, and its effects must be pursued down to their slenderest ramifications. A shadow in a daydream, an image too slowly dispelled, a badly exercised complicity between the body's mechanics and the mind's complacency. Everything had to be told. A twofold evolution tended to make the flesh into the root of all evil, shifting the most important moment of transgression from the act itself to the stirrings, so difficult to perceive and formulate, of desire. For this was an evil that afflicted the whole man, and in the most secret of forms. Examine diligently, therefore, all the faculties of your soul.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?